Hello, bonjour, je suis Katharine. Je vais parler en anglais parce que c'est difficile à me comprendre en anglais, peut-être, mais comme vous voyez, c'est pas évident en français non plus. Désolé, un jour, je vais maîtriser la langue de Molière. Okay, so I'm Katharine. Hello to the English speakers who don't speak French. There's probably only one of you here anyway. I'm a freelance game developer, and I've worked in a variety of development roles over the years: sound design, programming, game design, but also narrative design and writing. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. So my topic is writing comedy for games, and I'm going to talk specifically about working within tight constraints and how to even leverage and take advantage of those constraints in order to make comedy work. So why talk about constraints? Well, one of the particular challenges of writing humour for games is that as writers, we're expected to make humorous content that's as good as comedy that you see on TV and film. I think that's the aim, and that's kind of the audience expectation, that, you know, you can do it in TV, why not in games? Why can't you make that funny as well? But arguably, we've got far more challenging limitations and restrictions to deal with than these guys do. That's why they're lucky bastards. So while it's true that in TV and film, writers do have constraints of their own, these tend to be the same for each project. So they have a standard number of minutes for a film screenplay, for example, or a TV show. They can expect a certain production budget, typical number of locations, and a cast of actors. And this standardization of form has allowed TV and film writers to develop and evolve comedic conventions that fit within this form. Techniques and tools and rules for working within the limitations. And these conventions have become a language that we as an audience know, language for comedy. And we're comfortable and familiar with these conventions, and we know what to expect. But in games, as we know, games are so varied in form, with each game project that we work on having a potentially wildly different set of restrictions. Different game genres deliver story and dialogue in vastly different ways often. Different platforms, handheld platforms, PC gaming. There are so many differences between projects that we have to deal with. Open world games with lots of spoken dialogue, and beautifully rendered characters and cutscenes, or we might be working on a management sim with no dialogue, and so on and so forth. I worked on a few comedy games. Here is an old one. It was called Butterfinger. And it's a casual action game set in a martial arts themed universe in the 80s in Hong Kong. There's very little text, there's no spoken dialogue, it's all visual storytelling. So the comedy is often about combat, doing lots of visual gags, slapstick style humour, as you can imagine. And doing the narrative work for this was a bit like working on a comic book. And more recently, I worked on a comedy game called Astrologaster, which has just come out recently. And it presented a very different set of constraints and challenges for writing humour. The gameplay is very different. There's no action, really. There's no combat. There's lots of spoken dialogue. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that, I've already said it actually, every new project a narrative designer or a writer is asked to do, to deal with very different constraints. We're putting our story and our humour in different shapes and sizes. So our challenge as writers of humour is not only to come up with the comedy, it's to work out how to adapt to the particular set of constraints that the project throws at us, and adapt our comedic tools accordingly. Because unlike writing for film and TV, the set of tools and rules we use for one project is likely not to be appropriate on the next project. And so this very fact makes it difficult for me, or really anyone else, to draw out generalized lessons in a talk such as the one I'm giving right now. It's hard for me to generalize and say, you should do this on your game, because your game is probably completely different. But I'm going to try and make some general suggestions anyway. And I'm going to do that using this game, Astrologaster. Not only because it's come out recently, it's the most recent thing I've worked on, but it has a particularly tricky set of constraints that I think make for an interesting case study. So, in Astrologaster, as you can imagine from the name, you play as an astrologer who also is a doctor who uses astrology to diagnose and treat your patients. People come to you seeking advice for personal, professional, and medical problems. And by reading stars in the sky and doing a simplified version of real astrology, you can give them advice and solve their problems. These patients keep on coming back over the course of the game, and if they think you're doing a good job, they'll give you letters of recommendation that you can one day use to get a medical license and become a real doctor. And this, you may laugh, which is the whole idea. You may laugh, but it's based on a real historical figure, the true and unusual story of a doctor who lived in London around the time of Shakespeare, Dr. Simon Foreman. So, Jennifer Schneidereit is the director of this game. I'm Katharine, by the way, I'm not Jennifer. And she decided to turn the story of Dr. Simon Foreman into a narrative-driven comedy game. And then she hired me to do the writing and the narrative design. So my task was to how do I turn this into a comedy? And I know some of you are already thinking right now, astrology is just funny anyway because it's so stupid. I like science, like astrology, like that's inherently funny, right? Meanwhile, maybe a few of you are thinking, how very fucking dare you, astrology is real. I'm a Gemini, or, I know that there are various views about astrology in the room, but we don't care. The developers of this game, we don't care. Jennifer wanted this game to be enjoyed by people who think astrology is cool, and also people who think astrology is not cool. Also, astrology is stupid is a cheap joke that's not very funny for long. So the challenge was to get humour into this game using an astrological system, astrology, but without making fun of that system. So first, I'm going to, talk about making comedy within constraints. The first constraint I'm going to talk about is the obvious one. It's gameplay, broadly speaking. And the core gameplay loop of Astrologaster simulates what a real-life astrologer does. That is to say, the player does real astrological readings, but in a simplified way. This is the beginnings of a star chart. The sky is divided up into houses, sections of the sky, if you're familiar with astrology. So the gameplay in Astrologaster is more or less a sequence of patient consultations in which you do these readings. So over here we have the introduction, in which the patient explains the problem or question they want an answer for. It could be a medical problem or a relationship problem, career or business problem. In this case, it's a nosy woman who has seen a mysterious man sneaking into her neighbour's house. She thinks the man is a Catholic priest and that her neighbours are hiding him in their house because it was illegal to be a certain type of Catholic priest in England at the time. And then step 2, the player looks at a star chart presented in the form of the grid here and selects one of 3 answers to give the patient to her question. So A, B, or C. So from the looks of it, this is multiple choice, right? It's like a choose your own adventure game. Not quite. And I'll explain why. So this is kind of what I think of as like astrological algebra. So what the player actually does is look at the chart and choose a combination of astrological houses, sections of the sky, to form their answer. So for example, answer A is a combination of possessions being threatened, foreman wanting to murder the patient. That's just a hint in the game. That's probably not very relevant for the answer. Answer B is, well, her neighbours, who she thinks are hiding a priest, well, they're having difficulty having a child, and the mysterious man is a foreigner, so that has something to do with the answer. And answer C is, there's something to do with education and fine clothes, and an enemy who worships a woman. The Virgin Mary in this case, because he's Catholic. So this kind of differs from kind of standard choice-based games, I think, or at least interactive dialogue and narrative. So in the kind of conventional setup, you more or less directly control what the player character says. So you've got, you know, your choices, A, B, or C. The player reads those possible choices. Some of those choices are funny, and they laugh, ha, 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 that's funny. I'm going to choose the funny answer. And then they choose whatever answer they like or is strategically interesting for them in terms of gameplay. And then the player character delivers the answer, and they deliver it probably in a funny way. And you're like, ha, ha, ha. The way the character said it was really funny. I like that. And if the player character gives an answer that's not really what you expect, you don't like that. You feel cheated, you're annoyed because, you know, you wanted A, but they said B, you know, A wasn't what you expected. But for us, that's kind of part of the humour. So, for example, for answer A, those 2 houses, they mean, you know, the answer is the neighbours. The mysterious stranger sneaking into the neighbour's house is a burglar trying to steal their stuff. Answer B is the neighbours are having trouble having a child. Mysterious man is a foreigner. Therefore, it's a really hot Italian guy who's having sex with the neighbour's wife so that she could have a child, because the father of the house, clearly his sperm isn't strong enough or something. And answer C is, you know, it's kind of clearly hinting, guy who wears fancy clothes, who worships the Virgin Mary, it's a Catholic priest. So by the look of this, you could sort of think, oh, well, this really looks like a puzzle, but it really isn't, because maybe this is kind of a bad example, but much of the game you more or less know what choices you're making. But so instead of a puzzle, really, what we're doing here is more of a sort of a joke-telling system. It's a kind of a choice algebra that we're using to mediate story choices for comic effect. So instead of, you know, oh, I know what this answer is going to be, I already know it's funny, we're making a gap between the choice and the delivery of the choice at the end. We're trying to create some anticipation and expectation and a little bit of surprise. Because when you tell a joke, it's good to create curiosity and anticipation before you give the payoff. So I don't know if in France you tell this type of joke, you know, like a priest, a pastor, and a rabbi walk into a bar, right? So it's like, you know, this planet, this, and the house of whatever, and the planet Jupiter walk into a bar. Let's see what happens when that combination of elements come together. So, you know, the setup and then the punch. So I guess the general thing I might say is, you know, gameplay is about pacing and tension and release. If you can map that onto joke mechanics in some way, or look at how humour works, and then think, well, how can our game mechanics support that sort of the same type of mechanism? Because, you know, humour is about mechanics as well. I think that's useful. So, yeah. So, also on gameplay, a lot of games have this issue. Our game has it as well. The gameplay is very repetitive, and you know, like you don't want to see a review in the press saying this is a really great game, but it's very repetitive. And that can be a problem for gameplay, but I'm not talking really about whether the gameplay is good or not. I'm talking about comedy. So, you know, one thing about comedy is that repetition can be funny. So, so when you have repetitive structure in your game, you can go, well, okay, well, what aspects of repetition can I leverage for humour? Like running gags and recurring jokes, used a lot in TV, for example, right? Catchphrases that characters use. So, like one of the catchphrases in our game, you know, the sort of cliche that people say, you know, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Do you know that from film and stuff? So we have this thing about, you know, the Archbishop has this palace, all sorts of naughty things go on in the palace, and so a lot of the characters say, well, you know, what occurs in Lambeth Palace bides in Lambeth Palace, like like it's this kind of catchphrase. So we use repetition to sort of, we make repetition a feature rather than a problem with the game. So another constraint, it's not really a constraint on the game, well, it was a constraint on me. So this constraint I'm going to talk about now really briefly is that the astrology in our game is real. The star charts are real. The positions of the planets and the stars are real as they were in the late 1590s over London at the time. This meant that I had to come up with, you know, ridiculous stories based on the actual real meanings of planets in actual houses at the time of the consultations as the characters came to the doctor. So that was interesting and hard. And some of you thinking, you know, coming up with ridiculous stories based on astrology. That's what astrology is anyway. And, you know, others of you are also, again, offended by that, thinking, how dare you, astrology is real. But I'm not going to talk about how difficult it was. This is our tool, by the way. This is the tool that I had to use to read the, read the chart information and come up with the stories. But that was my burden to bear, and you'll never have to do that, so I'm not going to talk about that. So now moving on to production and, I guess, presentation constraints. The limits of your budget, what you can do, the scope of the game, the platform it's on. Have you all heard this phrase used before, like this adage, show, don't tell, like a rule in storytelling? And then in games, people have added something onto that, saying, well, you should play, don't show. You have the early levels of a game, and you don't tell them how to play the game, don't show them how to play the game. Walk them through by playing. People don't like cutscenes. Make things as interactive as possible. This is a really good. It's a nice principle, right? Wouldn't it be nice if we could all do that in our games? But the reality is, it's not as easy as that, I think. So, yeah. For our game at Astrologaster, showing was often not really an option, and certainly not, high degree of realism. The gameplay of our game is casual, and it's just one type of gameplay during astrology. So we can't play, through the narrative in all of its aspects. All of the story has to take place inside of Dr. Foreman's office, within the context of a consultation. The play sessions are really short because it's on mobile as well as PC, but on mobile, you're on a train, you want to play for a few minutes. So that's another constraint. And we need reasons for people to return to the game. So in these short sessions, we really have to have a setup and an answer and a reaction and a cliffhanger to get people to come back. So as I mentioned before, and I described the gameplay, we did try applying the play don't show principle to some extent, because you really do astrology as a way to explore the story, and you make decisions like an astrologer. But it's a casual game, and our ability to show is very minimal. So what is the solution? I think the best solution is to have millions and millions of dollars or euros. So I think, realistically, I mean, like, we're not Ubisoft. We can't, it's not Assassin's Creed Odyssey. Failing that, though, actually, and if you're interested in this, you should go to the other session that's happening right now about money. And so I know you're all here because you just don't give a fuck about money, right? Yeah, good. That's very, very healthy attitude until you need to pay your rent. So we had to come up with a solution, and our solution is actually based on the creative visual direction that Jennifer, our game director, set up for. And she used a theatre metaphor in order to solve the problem of our limited visual resources. And so I took this idea, and it helped me deal with the limitations for the story and the humour. So what she did was, you can probably remember from the screenshot before, she made it not really look like a consultation room, but like a theatre. And this really evokes the spirit of the time. It's the time of Shakespeare. So thematically, it's you know, an appropriate. We think it's a good idea. But what it really allows us to do is to get away with not achieving realism. We're just like, fuck it, this isn't real. You know, this isn't going to look real. But here is a device that that you're familiar with. That an audience, they know what theatre is, and it's something they can accept, hopefully. So, yeah. So, so using theatre allows us to use theatrical conventions to create a more powerful suspension of disbelief, like a contract with the audience, like, yeah, well, you're going to have to ignore the fact that there's no actual table, consultation table, and you can't see a notebook, and they're just standing there. But you accept that in theatre, that's to some extent. Theatre can have quite a minimalist presentation. Please note that I know nothing about theatre. Yeah, just want to. So if I say anything stupid about theatre, that's why. Oh Christ. So we're not asking them to believe that it's real. We're asking them to believe that it's theatre, and we're leveraging artificiality. So for example, I've just got an example there, a stage whisper. Stage whisper is where one character, will say something that sounds like a whisper that's actually so loud that the whole audience can hear, but apparently the person standing right next to them can't hear. That's super artificial, but the audience are prepared to believe it because they know what a stage whisper is, right? Another theatrical technique that we've used is the unseen character. I believe that Chekhov and Ibsen were famous for using this technique, but as I say, I know nothing about theatre. But the idea is that there's a character that never appears on stage, but that's referred to and talked about, and because they never appear, they become really powerful in the imagination of the audience. And we use this for comedy because this is a technique that is used, or has in the past been used a lot in British television sitcoms to great effect. So I'm going to play a video, sorry it's in English, but it's a 90s sitcom called Keeping Up Appearances, where the main character, Hyacinth Bouquet, she's always on the phone with people, and one of the people that she's on the phone with is her son. And you never ever see her son. He's gay, he's into all sorts of criminal and political activities. He always needs money. She's completely oblivious to this, and we never hear him speak either. We only learn about him through her conversations with him on the phone. And so he becomes this comedic figure in how sort of imaginations are going to try.
Sheridan! How sensitive of you to call, dear. What a close psychic link we have, you and I.
What does he want?
I don't know that he wants anything. He's just ringing his mother. You need how much, Sheridan?
Oh, shit, how do I turn this thing? Yeah. So, I mean, he always wants money. This is a recurring gag. Sheridan, the son, always wants money. He's always going to want money. And I feel like I know this guy, but I've never seen him. But if I saw him, it wouldn't be funny anymore, Perhaps my favourite unseen character in the history of British sitcoms is a cat. It's a cat owned by a character called Mrs. Slocum in a TV sitcom called Are You Being Served? And I suspect there's one member of the audience who knows this cat, right? Am I right, James? Right, okay. I'm building it up. Now I'm just gonna play this, and I think you're gonna work out why Mrs. Slocum talking about her cat is this recurring gag that becomes incredibly funny. And so here's a couple of clips of her talking about her cat.
My pussy got soaking wet. I had to dry it out in front of the fire before I left.
Well, if I'm to spend an evening in this club, there'll have to be accommodation for my pussy. Well, now we've got that sorted out, can we get on? I've got to get home. If my pussy isn't attended to by 8 o'clock, I shall be stroking it for the rest of the evening.
So if you... juste pour traduire, elle parle de sa chatte. And if you saw the cat, that would resolve the ambiguity and it, you know, and it wouldn't be funny anymore.
My pussy got soaking wet.
Ah, okay. So in Astrologaster, we do use this technique as well. Building characters and animating them is expensive, so why not just, you know, treat them like Mrs. Slocum's pussy. So, for example, you know, the Queen is quite active in our story, but Queen Elizabeth I. You never see her though. There's also the niece of one of the characters. She loves cockfighting. She loves roosters. But you know, again, the ambiguity you never see. You imagine all sorts of things in your mind. That's the idea. The biggest, the most important unseen character is Simon Foreman's manservant, William Buck. He's a real person. Historically, he's mentioned in Simon Foreman's casebook. And one of the things we know about him, he was really fucking hot. And Simon Foreman was jealous, and he thought his girlfriends, he had many of them, fancied William Buck. But we never show him, and his role, as it was in real life, was to bleed patients, like, you know, bleed them and put enemas up their ass and stuff. We talk about that a lot, but we never show that actually happening, and I think it's sort of like kind of funnier, like, to have all these procedures described and that you know what's going to happen to the patient. They're going to have, like, hot coal tar shoved up their ass. Like, knowing that rather than seeing that is kind of funnier in a way, I think. And imagining this really hot guy doing that. So I guess, I put the quelle horreur on the wrong slide. So what I was going to say before I undermined myself with my slide was, how does this solve the problem of show don't tell when you've got limited resources? And I want to say, well, it doesn't, and I'm getting in trouble for saying this, but you know, sometimes just tell, don't show. Oh Christ. So what are some of the other comedy benefits of telling rather than showing? Sometimes the actual telling is funny, I think, because of subjectivity. I mean, James kind of talked about narration and unreliable narration and subjectivity in his talk. So narrating events rather than showing them can make ordinary or unfunny, just boring events sound funny, because different narrators give different versions of events. They can be unreliable. They can tell more about their own character than about the events just by describing an event. Their biases and their prejudices are often where the humour is. And, you know, in Astrologaster, the real action in the game, the actual events of the game really happen between the scenes, between the consultations, the stuff we don't show, and the humour is in the retelling. This is the woman with the niece who loves cock roosters. Like I mentioned this before, I think telling gives imaginative space for ambiguity. In your mind's eye, you're imagining roosters, you're imagining penises, possibly at the same time in the same context. I don't know, that's up to you. That's the idea of giving that imaginative space. So Mary Payne often, she describes normal events unconsciously as sexual acts. They sound like sexual acts when she talks about them, but they're not. They're just ordinary things. A bit like Mrs. Slocum's cat. also, you know, confusion and not really knowing what the character is saying until they actually get to the point and reveal the point is, again, like that sort of joke-telling anticipation. Like, for example, you know, there's a lot of dialogue that you can't see. It's all spoken dialogue, so I've just got the main points here. But this consultation here is about a guy who is a hypochondriac, and he comes in and he says, like, I've been poisoned. And the doctor's like, oh, who did this foul deed? You know, I'm going to go and let's call the police. Well, there wasn't the police at the time, but, you know, let's call the guard. And you know, what are we going to do? You know, you're going to die or something. And he says, oh, well, you know, no, my friend George Spottle poisoned me at dinner. He served me cherries, and the Countess of Devonshire told me, you know, she says cherries are bad. It's a, you know, Gwyneth Paltrow. It's a piss take of her. So it's someone who, you know, who's into wellness and clean eating, and they think cherries are poisonous, but they're not. So, but you don't find out until kind of later that he's talking about cherries. So the telling of the event again is the whole point of the humour there, because the event itself isn't that funny. So. Anyone who's played the game will notice that we use a lot of music. Because I think if, you know, the presentation of your game is really, really minimalist and you don't have many resources and you're already spending money on music, like why not just add words? I mean, that was what I was thinking. Just like use every opportunity and use every element in the service of comedy. I mean, already, you know, music sets the tone of the game. You can have funny music, but, you know, in our case, we decided to use words because, you know, songs, I don't think songs are used enough in games. And a song can be a really good framing device, I think. So for Astrologaster, each character had its own song. They had their own song, and each song was split into verses. And a new verse was played at the beginning of each consultation, and the verse did a few things. It reminded you who the character was, because we had a lot of characters and they come in and you forget who was who, and they were like that. So they'd preface the consultation saying, "This is this character again, and this is what they're like." This is the character's goals, the character flaws, what their shtick is, their comedic traits, and it kind of hypes up the audience like an MC does, you know, like at a hip hop concert. You know, I'm not going to do an impersonation of an MC at a hip hop concert. It sets up anticipation, and you know, for example, like the hypochondriac I showed before. You know, here's the hypochondriac again. I wonder what he's going to do this time. Like. Set this up in the mind of the audience. Another thing we did with the songs is that we treated the singers, it's like a quartet, like of 4 singers, we treated them, like in the lyrics that I wrote, as a character in their own right. This is basically this is a theatrical technique as well that dates back a long time. More or less similar thing. You know, a Greek chorus in ancient Greek theatre, commenting on the action. And if you've seen The Muppet Show, who's seen The Muppet Show? Has everyone seen The Muppet Show? Right, yeah, so I'm not as old as I thought. So, you know, there's Waldorf and Statler who are like in the audience, like laughing, and they comment and they make insulting remarks about the performance, and our little group makes insulting remarks about the characters. Or sometimes they like certain characters and they make supportive remarks. They have their own thoughts and opinions. Yeah. Oh, so I'm going to give an example of. So this is introducing. This is one verse introducing a character called Riccardo Ferraro.
When the querent does rock a continental frock, 'tis Ferraro. Does rock a continental frock, when his Italian features on facial hair, 'tis Ferraro. Signor Ferraro.
I mean, this character is not all that they seem, but you know, like clearly they're a cliche of an Italian, or are they? Anyway. But I don't want to give any spoilers, so... Oh, Christ, why is... I'm not very good. Crap it.
When the querent does rock.
Fuck you, come on. So, yeah, actually, I was wondering whether to... because I don't know how much internet slang in France. Anyway, so this is a very sad song about masturbation. A wench is a woman. And I'm kind of annoyed with our game director and our composer because in the actual full version of the song, like the last line has like this beautiful polyphonic bit where they're like fap not, which is like my career highlight. But they cut it out because it was too long. It's going to be in the soundtrack when we release that. Oh shit! No, fuck! I was trying to. No, don't worry. Next. Okay, one more. Okay, one more. So Mary Payne, she's the one with the niece who loves cock. She's a Puritan. She hates Catholics. At England at the time, you know, if you were a Catholic, that was a really bad thing to be. Or.
Though our hero Simon's woman's not a Catholic, he disapproves of Mary for her views. They make him sick, but pray he does not tell her lest she punch him in the punch him in the
That's actually a Renaissance technique. That's actually period appropriate to go straight into fa la las when the dirty bits come in. I used to sing English madrigals. Oh shit. Anyway, okay. So I'll move on to constraints and language. And I don't want to talk about history too much because James already, you know, made all these points that I would have made anyway. Better than I would have. But one of the pieces of advice you get for writing historical language is, and James made this point, is, and it's very good advice, don't use archaic language. Just give the flavour of the period. If you think of, you watch Game of Thrones, I guess, people watch Game of Thrones. I mean, I know it's fantasy, but, you know, you get this feeling watching the characters that it's, you know, a bit old. But actually, if you look closely at the dialogue, they're actually speaking in a very modern way, but they make it sound old. And that's, you know, in period drama, English period drama that's set in the time of Shakespeare, or just before, like Wolf Hall is a really popular period drama in England set that's kind of recent, that's set in the 16th century. It sounds old, but they don't really use old language much. But we do, because why? Because period language is funny, I think, to a lot of people. And you see this in internet memes, you know, like people love, you know, nay, sir, and, you know, I bid you good day, and this kind of thing, because it sounds stupid, right? And you can make things sound, you know, it sounds ironically pompous and grand, and the stupidest, the more vulgar you are with highfalutin sounding language, the better it can be. But having said that, I mean, like, what I had to do was create a fake language, basically. Like a fake Shakespearean, just to have the colour and the vocabulary and the grammar that evokes that evokes the feeling of archaic language without reducing comprehension too much, because it's a trade-off. So I did this with, you know, deciding what grammatical rules I was going to use from the period and which ones I wasn't going to use. So, for example, you know, in French, we say, you know, je suis venu. You actually used to say that in English, you know, I am come. That's an early modern English element. Instead of I am eating, you might say I do eat. Already, if you're familiar with Shakespeare, that already sounds Shakespearean. I also, this is just a random snippet that's really big, that's embarrassing. This is some documentation of, like, I just came up with this big lexicon of ideas of words that I would put in the game and repeat and repeat and repeat often. James made this really good point. Taking historical concepts, or in this case, like vocabulary, that people aren't necessarily going to understand, and then repeating and repeating and repeating until they do. So it's actually the vocabulary in the game is quite limited, but you know, by the end of playing Astrologaster, you know what verily means, you know what forsooth means, or you don't, you know, you've picked up some vocabulary. It's very limited. Big weird words. So like some of the words, you're just not going to know what they mean. I actually made up a lot of words. They sound old, but they're not. They don't exist. Like strumpy humpy for sex, right? That's, you know, that doesn't. But you know what it means if you know what humping is, and you know what strumpets are, and you know what rumpy pumpy is. He knows what rumpy pumpy is. I mean, I don't. I mean, linguistically speaking, I mean, I don't know anything about his personal life. I'm sure it's great. So another thing we did with the language was to blend old with new. Why? The principal reason was because one of the problems you have with ye olde language is that characters can start to sound all the same, because it's like, you know, there's a sort of a barrier between you and the character, this ye olde pompous sounding barrier, right? So how do you convey class and character differences? I did slightly different vocabulary for different characters, but that's quite subtle. The most shocking difference, I guess, with one character is shown in one character. Humphrey Bell, he's an actor, and he's working class and he's young. And if you go to London, on the no, you'd have to take the TGV and then the Eurostar. If you go to London and you talk to anyone under the age of 30, well, most people under the age of 30 are working class, and they speak a particular dialect. Well, it's not a dialect; it's called a sociolect. They speak something called Multicultural London English, and I love this because it's like it's a whole other dialect. And they have a vocabulary and a grammar that's like really fresh and young sounding. So I thought it'd be cool to blend that into the young characters in the game. Because some of it actually sounds a little Shakespearean, because it has, you know, South Asian, Jamaican influences. You know, like it's got these colonial influences from a period where, you know, the English exported their language, and now they're getting it back. Some of this is old language, like the word vexed. So, you know, in multicultural London English, people love using the word vexed. So do people in Shakespearean London. So, oh, Christ, yes. I guess the final point I want to make about constraints and leveraging them, I guess one of the constraints that we have in games that you don't see as much in TV and film is we don't get away with as much. Like people, if we use adult themes or language in games, people can be really shocked by that and less tolerant than, you know, TV or film. And if you get a high age rating for your game, that kills sales. It makes it less likely that Apple will feature your game on the App Store. And Apple are quite clear about this. They say if you want to make art or, write a novel or paint a painting or something, but, the App Store isn't about art. So how do you deal with adult humour? Because our game is distinctively adult humour. And I think we can learn from the British. Thank you, James. Because the British, nos amis les Anglais, that they, in the 70s and 80s, and to some extent the 90s, they had a fantastic solution for making the filthiest jokes in prime time, during prime time television. So I would watch with my parents, I'm not British, but in New Zealand, ex-colony, we get all the British shows. I would sit down and have dinner in front of the TV, because that's what Anglophones do, have dinner in front of the TV. And we'd be watching that show, which I showed you before, Are You Being Served, with Mrs. Slocum's Pussy, right? That was, kids watched that. That's a family show, right? And there's endless sexual innuendo in that joke, not just about her cat. I won't go into the details, but that's a very filthy show. And kids would watch it, and it was completely normal because it was a family show. There was no explicit vulgarity. There was no swearing. It was absolutely family friendly. And I like to call this family filthy. So I think this is a principle we used on Astrologaster, like keep it. So I mean, occasionally, I get a note from Jennifer, the director. She said, "I don't think this is family filthy. You've gone a bit too far here, Katharine." And because that was our guiding principle. So I mean, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, this is. So we're talking about anal sex here, but we're not talking about anal sex, are we? Because I don't use the word anal, don't you use the word sex. She doesn't even know she's talking about anal sex. She isn't. I should stop talking about anal sex now, sorry. I'll leave that for the next talk. Who's after me? I don't know, it's lunch after me. You can talk about anal sex during lunch, that's fine. So I guess this isn't it could be a dirty joke actually, because it's like cracks and stuff. But anyway, no. So I guess my the overall kind of my concluding remark is your game might be a bitch to you want to plant a garden, right? But you've got a parking lot. I guess my point is find the little cracks. Put the comedy in those cracks, and sometimes it's the constraints enable you to do things in surprising ways that you didn't realize you could do. And that's my email address, and that's my Twitter. Thank you very much. Questions?
Any questions? No? Yes?
If there was a market share, a real market for it, would you like to do comedy with real adult language, or not really?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, this is an interesting challenge, but yeah, I mean, I think Gearbox gets away, like the Borderlands series, for example. You watch British television. Yeah. I mean, I'm a grown up. I'm trying to be a grown up. I'd love to explore. I think. I wish in games we had more freedom to be a bit, yes, that's the answer, yeah.
Apparemment, il n'y a pas d'autres questions. Ah, si.
Hello, thanks a lot for the conference. I was wondering, do you find it easy to find the kind of right balance between the humor when there is some kind of double sense with something under the belt, or and the humor you use, which is more situation-based, or the tricks you explained at the beginning with the situation where, with the cherry, for example, which is absolutely with no how do you say controversy, or yeah, something like that. Did you get my question? I'm not very easy with English. So.
Yeah, like, so you mean deuxième degré versus like...
versus...
like situational comedy. Well, actually, I mean, I probably gave a sort of a bit of a skewed representation of the game, because I pulled out a bunch of dick jokes and I put them in my presentation. I didn't talk about, I mean, there's a lot of humour in there that's kind of political, about Brexit, or about, you know, the wellness industry, like I think you saw a bit of that, or about gender politics. There's, you know, there's sort of, I guess, and there's a lot of situational humour where, you know, shit goes wrong based on advice you give. So you mean like achieving a balance between that stuff? I suppose it's also kind of a structural balance as well, because like a dick joke is just, you know, makes you laugh for a few seconds, but like a humorous setup that involves actual characters doing actual things and then coming back and telling you about them lasts longer. So yeah, it's sort of, I guess, more of about not the content of the joke, but whether the joke is, you know, at what level of the structure, that, you know, whether it's a quick one-liner or a more long-lasting kind of setup, I guess. Different layers. But yeah, I wasn't very scientific about it. I just kind of wrote funny shit that made me laugh most of the time. But yeah, there's some very deliberate things where I go, right, I'm going to build up to this joke and it's going to take, you know, 10 consultations before there's a payoff. I definitely put that stuff in there, which, you know, I knew, building up, like foreshadowing, planting, you know, those narrative devices, I used them for comedy so that there would be a comedic payoff, even if it was like an hour later, so that the player could, you know, feel a sense of satisfaction, that it wasn't just kind of cheap jokes like I showed up there all the time.
Okay, thanks.
Hello. You mentioned Brexit, for example, so I guess you have some jokes with references to the real world. Do you have a hard limit on this? For example, there are many games that which reference memes on the internet and this kind of thing. And in my opinion, those games don't age well. So what's your policy on that?
You're reminding me of the Anthony Birch talk he gave. He had this, half his talk was like, yeah, like, don't reference internet memes. And I think, yeah, it's true to some. It's also culturally limiting as well. You know, not like my flatmate, for example, she doesn't know what lolcats are. I tried to explain lolcats to my colocataire, and I said, you know, like, look, he wants a cheeseburger. That's really funny. She just doesn't. She's like, je vois pas l'intérêt, moi. Like, yeah, I think, yeah. So it has a number of problems. However, one of the strengths and also the weaknesses of our industry, well, no, it's not even a strength. One of the weaknesses of our industry is, like, you put out a game, right? Everyone fucking forgets about it a few years later. You know, like, if we were writing novels and you know, 90s sitcoms, you know, people still watch Friends. I don't know why young people watch Friends, right? I mean, like, get your own culture for your own generation. I don't know. But they don't do that with games as much unless they're really hardcore. So I think, you know, to some extent, it's like, what? Fuck it. Why? You know, our game's only going to be interesting to people for like 2 years. Why not make some contemporary jokes? yeah, internet memes may be a really bit specific, but you can see there are specific things in there that, you know, like I had to explain what fapping was to like people, you know, a studio full of London classical musicians. You will know it because I'm very pleased that you got that reference, but I don't think there's a problem. Like if you litter we littered the game of references that lots of people aren't going to get, but some people will. And when you get that one little reference, it's like reading Thomas Pynchon or something. You get that, you know, like I really like electronic music and voltage controlled synthesizers, for example. When I was reading The Crying of Lot 49, Thomas Pynchon, American author, and there's really obscure stuff in there about voltage controlled synthesizers from the 1970s. I know about voltage-controlled synthesizers. I got a real big payoff from reading that stuff because it was like only like me and like only a few other people would get that. So I think giving people that feeling is actually really, really valuable, even if it means a lot of people don't get the joke. Because if you just pile and pile and pile up with stuff, like there's going to be some stuff people are going to get. Well, that was my attitude anyway.
Thank you, Katharine.